Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Lucy Tassell.
I'm Zara Seidler.
Last week, the US Health Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., announced an investigation into what he called the autism epidemic and called the condition a preventable disease. Kennedy's interest in the causes of autism is long-standing, but he's never had a platform as large as leading the US Health Department before. In today's podcast, we'll explain Kennedy's history with autism, the new investigation, and what it might mean for autistic Americans.
Lucy, before we dive into this story, because there's a lot there and I want to unpack it all, but I do think that a good starting point is by actually just explaining autism, because that is at the centre of this story.
Yeah.
What is autism and how does it manifest?
So you've probably heard the phrase on the spectrum, possibly in the context of the show Love on the Spectrum.
Yep.
That's referring to the autism spectrum. So autism is a neurological condition. It can manifest in a number of different ways and to different degrees, which is why we talk about it as being a spectrum. It's diagnosed through developmental assessments and behavioural observations, and it's often characterised by differences in communication styles and issues with sensory processing. In terms of autism in Australia, where we are, according to the Bureau of Statistics, autistic Australians are nearly 6 times more likely to be unemployed than Australians without a disability, and the majority of young autistic Australians experience difficulty in school settings.
And so that paints a picture as to how autism manifests. But do we understand what causes autism?
Well, we know as much about the causes of autism as we do about the causes of any other kind of neurological condition, which is to say not much, but we think it could be a range of things. It could be genetic. It could be something to do with brain development. I think what it's important to say is that we don't know as clearly as we do, for example, that if you smoke cigarettes, your risk of cancer increases. We don't have that same cause and effect for neurological conditions, including autism. However, in the late 1990s, there was a man named Andrew Wakefield who published a medical study which he said suggested that a routine childhood vaccine, specifically the MMR vaccine, which is for measles, mumps and rubella, causes autism. His study involved 12 children, 8 of whom had been diagnosed with autism within a month of receiving this routine vaccine.
I do think it's important to say here that 12 children is not a large sample size at all. What's happened since that research was handed down?
Yes, the sample size was one of the many issues with the study. I should note also, according to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia's Vaccine Education Center, the MMR vaccine is administered around the time that children are most commonly diagnosed with autism, meaning it was a case of 2 things happening around the same time being wrongly considered as linked. A useful example might be, I get caught in the rain one day and a couple of weeks later I get diagnosed with depression. It doesn't mean that because I got caught in the rain and I got wet and I didn't like it, that I became depressed, even though I was sad on that day. It just means that these 2 things happened within a couple of weeks of each other. And that is what the scientific community now suggests was the case with Wakefield's study. So Andrew Wakefield actually later lost his medical license as a result of this study and some of the research processes that he went through to produce the study. It was found that he had breached professional ethics and forced children to undergo unnecessary medical procedures. The paper itself has been comprehensively debunked by many, many scientists. But there's a saying coined by American civil rights activist Medgar Evers: you can kill a man, but you can't kill an idea. Wakefield's official medical career is dead, but the idea that he put into the world is very much alive. Someone else who's used that phrase is Robert F. Kennedy's uncle, John F. Kennedy, who was President of the United States in the 1960s.
Yes, and we have done a whole podcast about JFK. Anyone that listened to that knows that I'm obsessed. But we're going to put that aside for this episode because we're not talking about JFK. We are talking about RFK Jr., so Robert F. Kennedy. Talk to me about his ascension to becoming the health secretary, because it's quite an unorthodox path here, and I want to focus on his career before we get to what he's now claiming.
As I mentioned, Kennedy's uncle was US president. JFK was assassinated in November 1963. The Kennedy family as a whole has been a huge part of US political life, specifically with the Democratic Party, for many decades. Kennedy's own father, Robert F. Kennedy Sr., was Attorney General to his brother and mounted his own presidential campaign before he was also assassinated in 1968. As for RFK Jr., he worked as an environmental lawyer for many years. He sued several major companies for pollution. In the early 2000s, in 2003 specifically, he has said he was approached by a woman named Sarah Bridges, who said her young son had become very ill and had been diagnosed with autism after receiving a routine vaccination. Kennedy then became convinced that mercury, which is a chemical element used in vaccines for preservation, was endangering children. Now, I should note, mercury was once used in vaccines, or rather a preservative derived from mercury. It was in the process of being phased out when Kennedy kind of took up this crusade. He published an article about the supposed connection in Rolling Stone magazine, which was later, several years later, withdrawn because it is not accurate. Following that, Kennedy chaired a non-profit organization called Children's Health Defense, which is an anti-vaccine organization, and he repeatedly said he believes a range of conditions from food allergies to autism are tied to these routine standard childhood vaccinations. So that kind of explains his interest in the world of health, I think.
And so what happened between this interest, specifically I'd corner the interest in, say, the anti-vax movement, to then him becoming health secretary? What happened in between?
In early 2023, so just jumping ahead a little bit, he launched a campaign for the US presidency. He was running as a Democrat. Later that year, he dropped out of the party and went independent. He then suspended his campaign in August 2024, and he endorsed Donald Trump, who, as we know, went on to win election and become president of the United States for the second time. And then after Trump's election, he appointed Kennedy as the head of the health department, which means he's the health secretary.
Yeah, and there was an understanding that when RFK dropped out, that there was some agreement between him and Trump. And so when he was announced as health secretary, I don't know that there was a lot of surprise.
No.
I think people really expected it.
Yeah.
But he's now been in the role for a couple of months.
Yeah.
And last week he announced this new major investigation. What is it?
Hi, I'm Ola.
And I'm Elliot.
We're the two-person team behind everything video and audio here at the Daily Aus.
If you want to help us grow so we can deliver more of the content that you love, be sure to hit subscribe.
Now let's get back to the video.
According to Kennedy, this investigation is going to be led by one of the major US government health bodies, which is the National Institutes of Health. It's going to be focused on the, quote, root causes of autism, including, according to Kennedy, environmental toxins. The National Institutes has also been tasked with examining food additives, mold, pesticide, medicines, and ultrasounds done during pregnancy. Kennedy said they've been asked to, quote, come back with an answer for the American people very quickly as to what he's saying is the cause of autism. Now, what's interesting to me is this investigation was announced on the heels of another US government research project, this one conducted by another government body, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, aka the CDC.
Lots of people would be familiar from COVID with the CDC.
Yes. The CDC's study found 1 in 31 8-year-olds in the US are autistic, which is up from 1 in 36 in 2020. The results came from data collected from 16 different locations across the country. I want to be clear, the report rejected the idea that, quote, living in certain communities put children at greater risk for developing autism. So effectively saying there are not environmental factors. Instead, the CDC said the differences in diagnosis rates across these 16 different communities, quote, might be due to differences in the availability of services for early detection and evaluation. So a fairly simple answer. Yeah. Kennedy then announced this new investigation right after having received this previous investigation, which suggested that environmental factors like living in certain communities don't impact autism.
And so his investigation is into whether that is the case or not.
Yes.
What's been the reaction to this announcement?
The announcement sparked quite a bit of backlash from health experts, from disability advocates, and from autism support organisations. In a statement responding to the investigation, the US Autism Society rejected Kennedy's claims, labelling his language as, quote, both inaccurate and stigmatising. They called it harmful rhetoric and a harmful policy direction that, quote, reflects a troubling lack of understanding, empathy, and respect. Part of that backlash centred around not just the investigation, but also around something that he said during his speech. He said, quote, autism destroys families. And in reference to autistic children, he said, quote, they'll never pay taxes, they'll never hold a job, they'll never play baseball, they'll never write a poem, they'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted. Now, as I said, autism is a spectrum, so that is not something that can be applied to every autistic person. And even though there are some people for whom that does apply, advocates say these characteristics don't make them of any less value as a person, nor does it, quote, destroy their family necessarily. Later in the week, Kennedy announced he wants a registry of all autistic Americans, which has raised concerns around people's privacy, as well about what has historically happened when governments make a list of people based on a single characteristic. So it will be very interesting to see what the outcome of this investigation is and what other moves Kennedy makes during his time as health secretary over the next couple of years.
Lucy, thank you so much for explaining that story, and it's definitely one that we will be keeping a really close eye on to see what happens with this investigation and what the Trump administration plans to do with that. That wraps up another week of the Daily Aus. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back again this weekend with all your questions about politics answered, but until then, have a great day.